I'm Samantha Anderl, co-founder of Harlow, an all-in-one tool for freelancers to manage their business. I'm also a former marketing executive and former and current consultant for early stage tech companies. I'm joined today by Jan Almasy, CEO of the agency Apex Communications. He also serves as head of community for Indie Collective and does a thousand other things that we'll get into in a second. But we're here together today to actually dig into how to create a compelling newsletter, but also how to build an audience for that newsletter. So on my side, I actually personally write and send our Harlow newsletter 1 to 2 times a month. That newsletter specifically is focused on helping freelancers with a variety of topics, ranging from building mindfulness and reflection into your business, all the way through figuring out how to get paid on time and everything else in that world. I've also personally helped a number of other early stage companies and small businesses get their newsletters off the ground over the years. So I'm super pumped to be talking to you today and really dig in here. But before we dive in any deeper, will you give us a little bit more on your background and experience with newsletters, specifically marketing, anything relevant?
So first, thanks for having me on. I think this is like I'm super excited to be able to sit and we've had a lot of great chats, outside of like recorded sessions. So I'm hyped to like dive into like a specific topic together because I feel
Yes,
like our conversations always go so many different directions, but this is going to give us like a container to have a lot of fun in for the next hour or so. So I started out my career actually as a registered nurse in the military. And so when I was in nursing school, one of the things that I think really got me intrigued in what later became the skill set that allowed me to launch newsletters and have a lot of fun with them was clinical psychology, empathetic listening, understanding how to communicate things to people, right? When you're an
mm-hmm.
RN, you have to communicate extremely difficult topics in ways that make people comfortable, or you have to
Yeah,
be able to take things that are super technical that like a physician will come in and say some really high level, academic type stuff to a patient and their eyes just glass over. And then you as the
totally.
RN have to come in and explain it in words that they understand. So that
Yeah.
was kind of the start in that place. But like you said, so as the CEO of Apex Communications, I write a weekly newsletter called 3 Things I Learned Last Week. I think we're sitting right around 700 subscribers on that newsletter right now. And that's a weekly newsletter that goes out. And it's basically just genuinely 3 things that I thought were interesting in the previous week.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the flip side of that, same as you, have helped a lot of people stand up newsletters, figure out who their audience is, how to leverage the newsletter to drive additional awareness, to drive revenue, things of that sort. And so as the head of community on the Indie Collective side, we write a newsletter once a month that goes out to about 1,000 people. And we cover topics very similar to the Harlow newsletter, right?
Yep.
We're a community of freelancers, coaches, consultants, brand engineers. I mean, a whole host of different careers inside of the Indie Collective community. We cover everything from what's the difference between an LLC and an S Corp? Why is that differentiation important?
Yep.
To how do you design your life, not just around a living, but what we call the 3 Ls, right? A living, a lifestyle, and your loving relationships. So those topics, they kind of interweave and intertwine, between more technical stuff like the LLC versus S Corp. So
Mm-hmm.
I need to have a little bit of that technical knowledge and background
Yep.
to more broad topics. That's how do you explore building a business and how do you feel about building that?
Yeah.
And that, has to go out on a monthly basis. It has to be a cadence. People look forward to it. I get DMs that people are excited that the newsletter is going to come out. And that brings that, a little bit of pressure to it when you're starting to
Totally.
get things moving. And that's one thing that I'm going to be passionate about diving in as we get into it is, yes, it's exciting to go and launch a newsletter, but once you've launched it, you got to maintain it and you got to keep doing
Yes.
it. So how does that play into everything? So super excited to explore all of these topics.
Awesome. And I actually personally subscribe to both newsletters that you were just talking about, and I can attest that they are both really, really fantastic for their individual audiences. Really, really wonderful newsletters.
I
Um,
appreciate that, Sam. Thank you.
yeah, they're so
Yeah.
good. Okay, I want to start at the very top, right? Like, say a freelancer, a small business owner, whoever it is, they decide they want to launch a newsletter, whether that is to represent their business, whether it's just to build a community, to just communicate to their community on a regular basis. How does one figure out the goal and target audience for their newsletter? Like where do you even start conceptualizing?
Well, I think so I actually give a workshop on this in the Indie Collective curriculum called Newsletter 101. And the first place that I start, when you're giving a workshop like that, if somebody's never written a newsletter before, you have to find ways to use analogies or explain it to them in a way that, kind of clicks outside of using newsletter jargon.
Yes,
right.
Take out the marketing lingo, put that aside. Yep.
Exactly. So I always like comparing it to moving into a new neighborhood. Right.
Okay.
So let's say, you are starting a business, you're a consultant, you're launching your, product or service. You've already got that stuff down. You know who you want to sell to, what you're going to sell them, what value you're going to provide. You've already kind of done that work. Yep. Right. That is your prerequisite. That's like buying your house in this new neighborhood. Right. You've done the work. You've now purchased this home. So what's, one of the first things that you do when you move into that new neighborhood is you get assigned a house number or an address, right? And what I like to say is when you move into that house, you want to make sure that you have a clean lawn, that your house number is well visible, and that people now know that they have a new neighbor, right? So what I compare this to is I like using LinkedIn as a playground personally. So this house number equates to your like about me and having an optimized profile. Like you want people to be able to find you. That's the first step, right? Step 2 is you don't just immediately write 50 letters and go shove them in your neighbor's mailbox. That's not how that works, right? You have to build a little bit of a relationship first, and you probably should find out what they actually are looking to read before you just start shoving letters in people's mailboxes. So the second step is find out where the watering holes are in the neighborhood, right? Is it the local park where everybody decides to go on a run? Is it, the dog park because there happens to be a lot of dog owners in the area? Find those places where people gather. And the way I equate this into social is searching for groups or finding other influencers that are in the space that you're trying to be in. Because early on in your stages, mimicry is the highest form of flattery, right?
100%.
Sometimes it's really, really hard to come up with your own creative idea right out the gate. It's way easier to like steal somebody's idea and make it your own a little bit. And I always like to say that all good ideas are stolen from Aristotle anyway. Like these ideas have been around for thousands of years. We're just kind of reframing them in a new way. So don't feel bad about borrowing an idea from somebody. The 3 things I learned last week, straight up stolen from Tim Ferriss. He writes a newsletter called 5 Things I Learned Last Week. I just shrunk it down because I'm lazy. So you find those watering holes, you find that influencer that that you kind of want to keep up with or that you want to imitate. And then you start joining in on conversations, right? You've now followed some of these people. You're seeing them pop up in your thread. Start commenting on posts and just play around and see, okay, what is resonating? Like what is getting likes? What is getting people started in conversations and what's not? I do this all the time when I'm still trying to come up with topics for the newsletter. If I have an idea, I'll like find a thread where it fits, comment something. And if it gets a bunch of engagement, I'm like, ooh, that's a good newsletter topic.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So you kind of use it as like this beta test, this testing ground. And then once you joined into a couple of conversations, you might start to make some friends. They will recognize you. They might start liking your content back. You might get invited to a party, right? So attend an event. Find an influencer that's hosting an event around a topic that you're passionate about. See how they structure that topic. See what they choose to talk about, in what order they choose to talk about it in. How do they engage with their audience? That again, imitation is the highest form of flattery. Take notes on the way that they do things. And then finally host your own party, right? This is where you actually reach the stage where you can put invites in a bunch of other people's mailboxes and they'll know who you are. They'll know where your house is. They'll know what kind of things you like to talk about. And they'll expect that this newsletter is going to provide them value.
Yes.
Right. So I like taking that step or those analogies of kind of introducing yourself to a new neighborhood to kind of tell people it's okay to pause for a second, like take a step back. You don't need to immediately jump into opening up your laptop, opening a Google Doc, and cranking out a newsletter. That's how I thought it happened when I first started writing them. And I was like, how do people do this? Like,
Which
do
for
they just
some,
get struck by lightning bolts and they just, have this amazing ability to do it? But that's not the case for me. I had to kind of reverse engineer it from the ground up.
I love that. I always like the first couple of points that you talked about here are really around listening, right? And I think that's such an important piece when you're launching any business, any community, any newsletter, whatever it is. The first step is listening and understanding, right? And I love that you dug in so deeply there and you're like, find the influencer, find the other person who's killing it, find the person that's doing it well, or find the other person that's just starting out that, you think is going to kill it, and just listen and watch. I think that is it's an underrated skill, right? Like
100%.
you have to start there. You have to really like tune in and focus. And I will say for Harlow specifically, before we launched product, before we launched marketing, before we launched our newsletter, the very first thing that I did was got on social media and started just interacting with freelancers, consultants, small business owners, and that's it. And I interacted with people for months before I tried to lead a conversation or before I tried to create a newsletter or before I tried to craft messaging for the business. And I was a freelancer, right? I was a freelancer. I was a consultant. I knew how to speak the language. I knew what the pain points were, but it really does take listening to the broader audience to get more specific and really understand what the wider crew is talking about.
Oh yeah, agreed. And I like how you said, you already intuitively knew what the language was or what those problems were because of your own experience. And sometimes I think we can convince ourselves that that's enough, right? That because
Yes.
we've had the personal experience that we have the authority to lead a conversation. And I always equate it to, picture meeting somebody for the first time and they come up and they shake your hand. And the first thing they do is like, hi, my name's Jan. I'm insert title here. I make this much. I do this, blah, blah, blah. And they just start brain dumping, all of these qualifications on you.
Uh-huh.
That's not the best way to make an introduction to somebody in real life, right?
Totally.
People leave conversations feeling amazing about the interaction when they feel heard.
Yes.
And so just taking that time to listen can do so much and open your eyes to so many different perspectives and topics and ways that you can approach things that otherwise you wouldn't have had the option to hear.
Yes. And I think it's very important to point out that when you're talking to a broader audience, even though you have a unique perspective and a unique experience, you do still have to listen to the broader audience and what they're experiencing, right? Because like you said, no one just wants to be preached at and say, okay, this is how I do it. This is how you should do it, right? People want to know
Right.
that you actually understand their pain points to a different level and that they want to know that you understand that they're having maybe a different experience than you are, right? It's like it's leading through empathy versus leading through just speaking and talking at somebody, right? You want to talk to them and with them.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that. Leading with empathy is definitely the way to go.
Yes, it's a phrase that I use a lot and it sounds really simplistic, right? Like lead with empathy, lead with feelings, lead with relating to people, but it's actually a lot harder to do than how it sounds because it takes all of that listening up front to do so, right?
Yeah, well, like we were just saying about how everybody leaves a conversation feeling amazing when they feel heard.
Yes.
We as individuals expect that from our interactions as well. So your default is going to be to speak because
Yes.
you want the other person to hear you.
Yes.
Right. And that's going to make you feel good leaving that interaction. And one of the things you have to like rewire, as I've really learned this as a head of community with Indie, I meet with 3 to 5 Indie Collective members a week in half-hour sessions. And I probably say 10 to 15 sentences in those half-hour sessions.
Yeah.
And I really had to learn, shut up, just sit back and ask another question, ask an open phrase, like let them have the floor, even though my default is to like tell them all of the things that I'm excited about, because that's what's going to make me feel good leaving that convo. So recognizing that that's like a human instinct and then kind of, backing yourself up and realizing like, oh, I'm doing that. I should calm down and like allow this person to have the stage is something that is a learned skill genuinely and does not come naturally at first.
Yes, I read something the other day that said the most charming, charismatic, and likable people are the people that make other people feel seen and heard, not the people that are seen and heard.
Ooh, yeah,
which I really, really love, right? And so when you're communicating, whether it's through a newsletter or marketing or through like a personal brand, making people feel seen and heard is the way to go, right? So
100%.
okay, so kind of building on that, we talked a lot about listening up front, kind of imitating what other people are doing, really like, so listening to your audience, also learning from the people that are already doing it well. But when it actually comes time to like craft that newsletter and start putting together the content, right? And figure out a way to make it truly compelling. Do you have any tips for the way that newsletters should be structured or the way that they should be written? Anything along those lines?
I think, to start with some like basics, right? In the newsletter 101 workshop, I always talk about formatting is like a very, very simple thing to focus on.
But it's hugely important.
It's huge. It's very huge. Yeah. It's like I actually am a boxer, and one of the things that we constantly focus on inside of boxing is the fundamentals, right? If you don't have good footwork, if you don't have good defense, you're going to get knocked out. That's just like how the game rolls. And I look at formatting as good footwork, right? It's highly necessary. Even though it's not the flashiest part of your game, it is highly necessary. So don't just have like an all white page with a bunch of text on it. That's terrible. And you might be very passionate about the information that you put in there. I can promise you somebody's going to get like an eighth of the way through that block of text and they're going to, they're gone. So some of the quick and easy formatting tips that I always use, and I always explain is, color contrast between blocks, right? So have your brand colors loaded into whatever program you're using. I personally use MailChimp. And so you have, maybe a header. So at the top, so a header is like your title, right? You have a big title, and then that might be one color of your brand image, and then it flips to another color, and then it flips to white, and then it flips to another brand color, and then it flips to your call to action at the bottom, right? But even that subtle difference in color kind of keeps people engaged as they're looking through. And then making sure you have those big, bold headers at the top of each section that straight up outline, like, what am I expecting to see inside of this block? Right. Is super, super helpful. And then also another tip that I like to use, because I tend to be long-winded. I was trained as a creative writer, not a copywriter. So I write like fiction. I write a lot of, self-help type stuff. I wasn't really trained to be short and concise. It's something that I'm still learning. So don't be afraid to link to additional things that you've created outside of the newsletter. Right. I do this all the time in 3 Things I Learned last week. I'll write like a little intro paragraph to like an Andrew Huberman podcast that I listen to about neuroscience. Try to explain something as simply as I can. Here's a link to the YouTube video. Go watch it. Right. I'm not like giving you the full transcript of the YouTube video in the newsletter. It's just short, it's concise, it's skimmable. My rule of thumb is you're sitting somewhere between like 70 and 200 words per block, max. 200 is really pushing it. But you keep that short, you keep it concise. Don't be afraid to link out to other stuff. And then finally, like another piece that I think makes things compelling to an audience and kind of keeps them engaged is seeing people like them that are interacting with or reading the newsletter. Right. So in the Harlow newsletter, you have the freelancer spotlight section. That is a fantastic way of doing that. In the 3 Things I Learned last week, every probably 5th edition that I put out. So it's a weekly thing. So it's not all the time, but every 4th or 5th one that I put out, I have a reader spotlight. And I just straight up, take a profile picture of one of my readers, their LinkedIn bio. It takes me very little extra time. But I'm actually highlighting and I'm showing the readers, hey, here's someone else like you that is reading the newsletter and getting value out of it. And kind of makes everybody feel like, oh, this is a real community, right? Like this isn't just a newsletter. This
Yes.
is, again, back to the neighborhood analogy. I'm highlighting a neighbor that I really like inside of, our neighborhood.
Yes.
And it makes people all kind of feel like they're a part of a community rather than just a newsletter reader. Because at least for me, there's hundreds, if not thousands of newsletters out there.
Yep.
And if I start to feel like I'm just a number, or like this newsletter is just hitting me up constantly and there's not really any added value, nothing's really changing, there's no, section that pops up every now and then that catches my eye, kind of get bored.
Yeah.
And so that's another way I think you can kind of make it compelling, is bringing in people that are actually readers and highlighting them.
I like all 3 points that you just made, but I want to dig in specifically there to the human element and adding the social proof. I think that is so important, especially if the newsletter or communication is coming from a brand, right? So when if you're like behind your personal brand and you're writing a newsletter and it's you're the face of it, like there's already this human element that comes with your writing and how you're communicating that message. But if you're a brand, or even if you're like a solo human who's, creating content under like a name, right? Maybe it's like, an example is like Ashley Cummings' newsletter is Content Connect. I hope I didn't misrepresent that. Content Connect. And so she's actually writing it, but Content Connect is actually a brand, right? And so it's so important to bring that human element into that, like you said, so people don't feel like they're just a number, another subscriber, right? They want to know that other people are reading, other people are engaging, other people find this helpful. I really love that you brought that up.
Yeah. And so to kind of lean into that, the brand side of the house, like on the indie collective side of writing the newsletter, right? That newsletter, there's 2 of them that go out per month. And one of them is a members only segment that goes out to our graduates, right? So that list is, we just hit 500 graduates from the indie collective program, which I'm super hype about.
Amazing.
And then there's the big list, right? There's the mass blast. And these are people that have watched a training, one of our free training seminars that got put onto the list. These are all the opt-ins, right? So that list is like approaching 2,000 plus. And it's really important in those mass blasts. Like the member segmentation one, there is kind of still already that human element there. They recognize me as the head of community. They recognize each other. They're all graduates.
They've been able to talk to you. They've seen you present. They've had conversations with you. Yep.
Exactly. And they also kind of speak the same language, right? So when I say something like a team, they know what that means. They know that's a small group of 3 to 7 people that all come together to help support each other through a cohort. So I can use that type of language. I don't have to work as hard to create that personal touch. Whereas in the mass blast, what I love to do is anytime we get a new partner, I'm highlighting that partner in the next mass blast, right? And this isn't even something that the partners are asking me to do. Some of them, for sure, we have, an exchange where, they're highlighting us in their newsletter, we're highlighting them in ours. But a lot of times it's, if I think somebody's doing some really cool stuff in the freelancing space, I'm throwing them in there. And I'm allowing them to get that visibility. New members will send me things that they've accomplished, right? In one of the last mass blasts that we put out, we have this community member named Lily Graff, amazing climate change consultant in Italy. And she recently went to, I'm not even going to try to remember the name of the Italian town because I'll just butcher the pronunciation anyway.
But like I did with your last name. It's okay.
Right. That was before we started recording, right? You got it when we actually hit the button.
Totally.
But she went to this town that experienced a major flood and volunteered to like clean up this town. And was there for a week and a half and had videos on LinkedIn and all this other stuff. And then another member, Brandy Cern, she launched her brand and like launched a company. And so I took like some of these members that had done really, really cool things, and not all of them had to do with business. Right? Not all of them had to do with how to make money or how to, scale your brand, how to raise awareness. Like Lily's was genuinely just like, she's being an amazing human. Let's go ahead and put that into the newsletter, because that shows that we're not just trying to monetize you as the brand. right?
Yes.
We genuinely believe in you as a human wholeheartedly, and we're cheering you on as the Indie Collective brand. And so it kind of brings our voice full front.
Yep.
And I got so many messages from people that were like, wow, that actually inspired me. Like, I'm out volunteering in my local city now,
Yeah.
because I saw something like that. And then to know, as the person curating the newsletter, that, inadvertently taking that story and choosing to highlight it caused, a bunch of other members to feel the urge to go out and volunteer in their communities. That's an irreplaceable vibe.
Yeah.
Like, that
That's
makes me
really
so
beautiful.
happy.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. And it had absolutely nothing to do with anything that would quote unquote further the brand,
Sure.
right? By business standards. In my eyes, that relationship, that deepening of that human connection is so much more important in the long term.
But that is like that is the definition of brand building, right? The brand building is about making somebody feel and making them want to take action, and having that good, beautiful feeling associated with your brand, whether it's directly related to the topic that you're focusing on or not, is incredible, right? It goes back to what we talked about earlier with leading with empathy, right? Like, it doesn't always have to be, here's how to do X, Y, and Z in 5 steps, right? Like, that kind of content is super helpful, and it's helpful to educate and to help people learn. But if you can
Right.
foster relationships with your brand, that's the end goal, right? Because then they have all these positive feelings toward you as the writer, towards you as the head of community, and toward the brand, because you're taking the time to foster these relationships and highlight these relationships. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, yeah. And now, every time they go out and they're volunteering at that place, they'll be thinking about, what inspired them to be there in the first place. And
Yeah.
it ends up coming back to, the Indie Collective community is this cohort of amazing people that inspire me on a daily basis to be the best that I can be, both in, my consultant role or my coaching role or whatever I'm doing as an independent,
Mhm.
but also in the life that I'm choosing to live, the lifestyle. Again, back to those 3 L's that we focus on, right? It was the
Yep.
living that you're creating, the lifestyle you want to have, and the way you choose to spend time with your loving relationships.
Yeah. And I know that, your audience and my audience, very specific. There are a lot of freelancers, small business owners. And so what we're talking about is really, really relevant to them. But I think regardless of who you're focusing on, you're still talking to a human, right? And that
Right.
human is diverse and they have, external interests. And so I know some people might be listening to this and be like, okay, yeah, like freelancers always talk about lifestyle and how to find better balance and, all of these things, but everybody cares about that. Regardless of who your audience is, you can figure out that path to take to build that human connection with them.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And if you were to peruse my LinkedIn profile and then, hop over and hit me up on IG, you're gonna get 2 different versions of Jan. I always tell people that
And
too,
I, and
right?
I, and I know both, which is really nice.
Yeah.
But no,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, you're a diverse human. You are interested in a lot of different things, and brands can relate to you in a lot of different ways. But again, that goes back to listening, right? Like, you listened to this story that this woman told and this experience that she had and brought it up and highlighted it, right? And the first step for you was listening and learning about that and then pulling it into your communication.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, so I kind of want to double click on that because I think
Mhm.
that's super important. If you are, you're listening to this and you're a fresh community manager, or
Mhm.
you're somebody that is just, launching your brand and starting to write your newsletter, or you're even writing your personal newsletter. The personal newsletter, to your point, is a little bit different because you already kind of have that human element there.
Mhm.
Um, Once you've taken the time to go through those steps that we talked about in the beginning of moving into the neighborhood, setting up your house, attending the events, having conversations, going to a party, and it's like, now it's time for you to host the party,
Yep.
right? Understand that, in the beginning, there could be a lot of imposter syndrome about, is this thing that I find interesting worth the telling,
Mhm.
right? And I dealt with that. I still deal with that sometimes, right? But I dealt with it really heavily early on.
Yep.
Um, and what I'll say is once you've gone through the steps of listening and empathizing, and I like to think of it as training your intuition, right?
Mhm.
It's like the first time you step on a jujitsu mat, you're probably going to be terrible, right? But once you've been doing it for a year, then there's going to be somebody that comes in that is, newer than you, and you're actually going to figure out, oh, wow, my instincts are actually trained now.
Yep.
My body just kind of does things without me having to think about it.
Yep.
So once you've had that intuition trained, don't doubt yourself. If a community member comes up to you and says something that you're like, holy crap, this is compelling, don't be afraid to shout it from the rooftops, right?
Yes.
Because your intuition has now been trained to pick up on those amazing topics because you've put in the work to listen.
Yep.
You've walked the walk, right?
Yeah.
So trust yourself that when your smoke alarm's going off, you're like, ding, 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 ding. That's definitely something that the community needs to hear about. Let it rip.
Yep.
Because your gut instinct, I think we underplay our intuitions a lot.
Yes.
And once that kicks in, go for it. I 100% am a proponent of going for it if something really hits home for you.
Yeah, I think you touching on imposter syndrome here it wasn't even like on my list of things to talk about today, but I think that is a really important piece of this is when somebody's first starting out, there's no way you're not, I mean, some people never experience imposter syndrome and I don't fully understand that, but
They're aliens.
right.
I have no idea.
Yeah, anytime I start something new, I've started a number of different businesses, a number of different, I start work with a new client and I've dealt with 40, 50 different clients in the past. There's always a little imposter syndrome that kicks in as you're like figuring things out, right? As you're learning and trying to understand and trying to build something from scratch. And so it is really important to note that most people feel that, and you shouldn't let that hold you back from building the thing, right? Don't let that hold you back from sending your first newsletter, even if you don't feel like you're totally prepared or you don't feel like people should be listening to you. You have to start creating to get there and to get comfortable, right? So just like you said, like you use the
100%.
jujitsu analogy is that like you have to get out there, right? And like your first newsletter, your second newsletter, they might be pretty bad. They might be great. You don't know, but like you have to start putting things out there to also then get feedback, which is kind of the next step, right? So once you figure out, you listen and you learn and you're ready to create, then it's really about iteration, right? And iteration is about going back to those first two steps, which is listening to feedback from your community and iterating and figuring out how to continue making your newsletter better. Because I think you said this at the very beginning. You're like, okay, these are the steps to like creating your first newsletter. Now that you have a newsletter, here are the next steps, right? So
right.
Along with that, I kind of want to talk about two things. One is building like a promotion plan for your newsletter, right? So and these things probably happen in tandem, right? Like you need to start building your audience and building your list as you're starting to create. But I want to talk a little bit about like, how do you successfully promote your newsletter and build your list and build your audience in an authentic and, really like non-icky way?
So I think there's a couple of different approaches that you can take. And I've seen people be successful with, I'm just going to narrow it down to two. Right, for sake of time, but one of them is really focusing on building the list before you launch the newsletter, and the other one is jumping off the cliff and building the plane while you're flying it, right? You launch the newsletter and then the list kind of builds itself as you're iterating.
Two
totally different personality types.
Yes.
Right, I'm more of the jump off the cliff and build the plane while I'm flying it, right? So and that methodology tends to work better with your personal newsletter than it does with a brand, right? With a brand, you don't necessarily want to just like try and fail immediately out the gate. You're doing more of like we were talking about earlier, right? Commenting on threads. You did a lot of listening. You're a great example of how that can play out. You're listening, you're kind of talking to people and priming them that this is a topic that I'm genuinely interested in exploring. Is this something that would interest you? Right. You're hitting them up in the DMs because they've responded to like 5 of your comments now and they've liked 10 of your posts. And you're like, hey, I'm actually thinking about writing a newsletter. I'm thinking about boom, boom, boom. What are your thoughts?
Yep.
And that does a couple of different things, right? It gives you that feedback so that you can actually craft a newsletter people want to read. But then also, when you put out that first post on LinkedIn that actually says, here's a call to action, please subscribe to my list, you have a bunch of people that already know, oh yeah, Sam's been building this for a couple of months.
Yep.
I'm super excited for this to come out. So that's kind of one piece, right? On the more strategic side, to kind of keep building off that, like conversations and sliding into DMs and having those types of pieces, you can continue to build that list in an omni-channel way, right? And that's a fancy marketing term. Omni-channel really just means like all over the different social platforms, right?
Just lots of channels. That's omni-channel.
Lots of channels.
Yep.
Yeah. So you talk about it on Instagram, put it on your story. I can't count the number of times people have DM'd me and been like, man, I wish I had a LinkedIn. Or I've actually had people create LinkedIns to read my newsletter because they saw it on Instagram. And now they're, I told them, sorry, like I'm not putting it anywhere other than LinkedIn right now. If you want to read it, you're going to pop over there.
Yep.
It happens on Facebook. It's really easy to actually, a lot of the apps have built-in integrations now, where you can just, take a screenshot. I know that Threads and IG is big on that right now. You can just take a screenshot of it, put it on another platform. Same thing. It's not Twitter anymore because it's X, but same thing with Twitter.
We could go into a rabbit hole about that, but
that's a whole thing. But there's apps out there that will just take a little screenshot of I'm going to call it a tweet because I don't know what else to call it, but take a screenshot of your tweet and then that now becomes an Instagram post, right? Like there's ways to throw that out on the brand side and iterate really quickly. And then I also really like, as you're kind of building that list up, being transparent about the process. So on the indie collective side, especially, and this is kind of keeping in that brand headspace, I'll take short little videos of myself as I'm writing it and say, ooh, I'm really excited about this topic that I'm writing about this month. Or I'll point my phone at my laptop screen and do a quick little scroll of the newsletter that I just wrote. Been like, it's dropping in a couple of days. Like, if you want to hop on, like, now's the time to read. And I see those posts, on your LinkedIn feed too. It's, hey, here is insert social proof. There's X number of people that are reading this. Here are the types of people that are reading it. Here's why they're reading it. You should subscribe, right? And you can kind of follow that simple formula across all those platforms. So that's kind of that methodology on the brand. I need to kind of focus on building the plane before it even takes off the runway. When it comes to just like the rapid iteration, that tends to work better if you're, just building a personal brand. All of those same things still apply, but you can be a lot more flexible with everything, even down to format, structure, things that you're including, the types of topics that you're addressing, right? When I first put out 3 things I learned last week, its original intent was to be 3 things that I had personally learned in my life, not 3 summaries of things that I had learned from other people. But then I very quickly realized within the first 4 newsletters that it was taking me way too much time to dig through my memory, link experience that I had had with the experiences that my audience need to hear about, and then write about it. And it was giving me wild amounts of imposter syndrome. So I was like, okay, I can't do this because I'm like trying to put myself out there, right? So I switched and I was like, okay, I'm just going to try to keep the tempo. So how do I force myself to write on a weekly basis, but decrease the pressure that's associated with putting it out? And so it became 3 summaries of other people's wisdom in the newsletter. And so then over the course of 4 or 5 months, I got used to that tempo, right? On a weekly basis, I got used to putting it out. There's not a lot of imposter syndrome because Andrew Huberman is a PhD scientist from Stanford. Tim Ferriss is Tim Ferriss. All of these people that I kind of pulled stuff in. Brene Brown is Brene Brown. Like, I didn't have to second guess whether or not this information is valuable or accurate. And it wasn't my own voice. But it got me used to putting something out on a weekly. And now I'm challenging myself, now that I've gotten that rhythm down. Now I'm challenging myself to putting out content that I'm actually focused on, and things that I'm passionate about. And what that did to grow the audience is every single time I tagged one of those influencers and every single time I highlighted one of their things, it shot out to their audience,
Yes.
right? I was tagging them in it. I was tagging their resources. I was using their hashtags. And when I look at my followers now, they're somewhere between the 600 and 700 mark on the three things I learned last week. They're all following those influencers. So my audience is a bunch of like neuroscientists, psychology, passionate people,
Yep.
freelancers, co-founders, all of those types, because of people that I was choosing to tag. So that's another great way to kind of do things and expand that audience. Is don't be shy to tag people and shout other people out. Give them a reason to promote your newsletter on their feed, right?
I love that so much. We did the exact same thing when we were launching the Harlow newsletter. If you look at the Harlow newsletter, the first time we sent it to now, the first time we sent it, I was not really giving my opinion. I was taking tweets and articles that other people were writing, that they were posting on their sites, that they were posting on their social platforms. And I was really highlighting other people and letting that kind of tell our story and tell our narrative, like letting other people. So you were talking and I was like, yep, I did the exact same thing. And again, by doing that, by tagging these people, highlighting these people, that is a channel of promotion, right? Like they want to promote you. You're featuring them. That feels really good to them. It's a great way to get in front of their audience and kind of expand your audience. I love that. And then, like you said, as you iterate and build, then you bring some of your personality and your opinion into it, right? Because you do at some point, like you want to be an authority, right? Like you want people to trust you and you want people to trust what you're saying. And so bringing your personality and your opinion is necessary, but it's really kind of a balance between the two, right? Like you're probably never going to move away from highlighting other people, like other information from other people that you think is really valuable. But what you're going to do is you're going to mix that in with your opinions and your thoughts and your learnings. And I think once you get to that point where you can give both your perspective and the perspective of others together to tell a narrative, that's a really beautiful and compelling message.
Oh yeah, boom, 100%. Yeah, this is the second time that you've gone on a deep dive that I have nothing to add to. Like that was just
well, I was
that
technically
was
just
really
building
well
and
said.
I was just building and summarizing what you were saying. But two other things that you talked about here too. The first is when you were talking about like posting on social specifically and posting across channels, you mentioned both like there are these social posts that are like, hey, here's exactly what you're going to learn. Here's like a how-to. And then there's these posts or this message around promotion, which is like feeling based, right? And I think this is also a really good example of everything we've been talking about today, which is like creating something really compelling, whether it's a newsletter or a personal brand or a business brand, is really about marrying the two, right? Like you want people to know that they are going to learn something and that they're going to have a tangible takeaway from this thing, but you also want them to relate to the person creating and putting that message out there. And so I just wanted to call that out because I think that's a really important piece of like a promotional strategy for a newsletter specifically. But again, so many things outside of a newsletter is give people the human element mixed with this is what you're going to learn. And that is like the combination that really gets people to like subscribe and engage with you because they have to get to know you on a deeper level to really show that interest.
100%. I've had conversations. I want to I think we spent a lot of time in this conversation kind of talking about freelancers and brands that serve by the nature of both Harlow and what Indie Collective does. And I want to kind of challenge like bigger brands that maybe think that they can't do this because they're I'm so and so large and we have this many customers and I can't make it personal. People aren't dumb, right? They know that there's somebody behind the newsletter. Generally, it's a marketing manager, it's a head of community, it's some position within your company that people are aware of, right? Ever since I like to say that like the social dilemma being released in 2020 just like released this Pandora's box of awareness, people coming into awareness of how social works and all this other stuff. Even just having like at the bottom of every Indie Collective newsletter, for example, it doesn't end with thank you for reading the Indie Collective newsletter. It ends with, from Jan and Sam. So from the founder and the head of community. And just that simple act of signing it and putting a human name at the bottom of the newsletter, whether it's the founder and the CEO, it's a letter from them, it's something that has a person from your brand associated with it that people
Yep.
can recognize, that they can tell isn't some template doc that was copy and pasted by a PR rep into the
Yep.
newsletter, right? Like it's from the heart, it's signed by somebody. That simple act of having a human name attached to it in some way, shape, or form can completely change the perception around your newsletter. So I would advocate for, humanizing it as much as you can, especially now when people are becoming more and more aware of how marketing and stuff actually works. It's like we used to exist
1000%.
behind this curtain,
Yes.
right? Like we're like the Wizard of Oz or something like that. And now people are like getting to pull back the curtain and they're realizing we're just like a really short dude with a wizard wand. Like,
Yes. I love that. I think regardless of the size of the company, you can and should humanize your message. Everybody is talking to people, regardless of how big your company is. Every user, every customer, every prospect, everybody is just a human, and they want to be spoken to like a human, and they want to know that they're being spoken to from another human, not a brand, right? And that's really scary. I was just talking about I've been talking about this actually a lot recently, but like how scary it is to put yourself out there and how vulnerable that can feel. And I think that's why a lot of like brands or people just in general kind of hesitate to do that, because they're like, ooh, once I associate my name with it, then yeah, I get positive feedback, but no matter what, there's going to be negative feedback. And I have to,
opening the door.
and you have to feel that too. But as creators, whether you're creating a newsletter for your personal brand or a small business or a larger business, like as a creator, you really do have to put yourself out there, at least I believe, to be successful.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, I know we're getting kind of to the end of our time here together. So I just want to give you
already?
I know. We've been chatting for a while, but I just want to kind of give you a space for any additional tips, tricks, learnings that you've picked up that you want to share with people. I know it's broad.
Like we've already hit so many.
I know.
I think just double clicking on the idea that we kind of lightly touched on the imposter syndrome piece. I think I kind of want to double click on that for just a second. It's don't underestimate how much people enjoy watching other people or brands get passionate about the things that they're passionate about.
I love that.
So I still, like I mentioned, still deal with imposter syndrome every now and then. Not so much on the Indie Collective side when I'm putting out the Indie Collective newsletter, right? Because that's a little bit more of me just kind of pulling together resources. And I like to think of it as I'm curating that newsletter, whereas my newsletter, I'm creating that newsletter.
Yeah, that's a
little bit different.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a little bit different. There's a little bit of a difference there. And so when you're trying to create a newsletter, and you feel passionate about writing and you're putting that out, the amount of times that I've been like, ooh, I have a dissenting opinion on this topic. Like, I don't actually agree with all of the things that the masses are saying. And I have not said it. I regret, right?
Yeah.
And the further I've gone into my journey, the more I've realized that part of the reason why people really value my opinion, and the reason why they'll value your opinion, and if you're listening to this, the reason why they'll value your opinion, is because they know that you've taken the time to look into it, and they can tell you're passionate about it, and they'll be able to feel it while they're reading it.
Yep.
If it's genuine. So don't be afraid to lean into the passion, even if you feel like it might be a little spicy.
Yeah.
Right. Like, hey, that's a good thing.
A little
hot take never hurt anybody.
Yes, a little spiciness goes a long way.
Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to eat just straight cornbread chicken. Like, you got to put a little bit of paprika on there. You got to put some garlic powder. Like, you got to add a little bit of flavor into it. And then on the other side of that, I think, if you're thinking about putting out a newsletter, and the only reason why you can think of to put out this newsletter is to do more business or to build a list because you Google the top 5 ways to, raise awareness around your brand. Just don't put it out. You'll save yourself a lot of heartache. You'll save yourself a lot of pain. And you'll save a lot of readers their time, because
Yeah.
that's not the whole mentality behind putting out a newsletter.
Yeah.
You should really focus on what you're super, super passionate about. And if that happens to align with your business interests, then for sure. And even if it doesn't, right? Like the 3 things I learned last week is really just about me allowing people into my headspace so that they can see the types of things that I'm genuinely interested in, because I found out that people genuinely are interested in them. They want to know what I'm looking at, what I'm thinking about, why I'm passionate about it. And I could talk about any of the topics that I put in that newsletter for hours, right? Like we just teleported. This is one of my most favorite topics to talk about. My most favoritist, right? Topics to talk about. And this hour just like vanished, right? Like it doesn't even feel like we've been on the phone for a full hour.
Yeah.
But that's because I could literally go on about this for hours. So this is something that's a good indicator that this is something that you could write a newsletter on, and it'll be sustainable beyond just those first couple of editions. You'll be able to keep it up, because I can promise you, same whether I'm newsletter or like I've put out 200 plus podcasts in the last 5 years. When it comes to keeping that tempo, part of it's discipline, part of it just comes down to raw passion and grit. And if you don't enjoy what you're talking about, you won't keep up with it.
Okay, I love that tip so much. And I've actually seen a few other creators talking about this recently, where they were like, you know what, originally when I think it was Amanda Goetz, she was like, originally when I was going to put out my newsletter, everyone's like, why isn't it on marketing and how to build teams or whatever it was? And her response was, that's not what I'm passionate about. What I'm passionate about is like my mental health and finding balance and raising my children. And it's such a cool thing to be like, hey, if that's what you're passionate about and that's what you can talk about long term, that should be the focus. Don't do this thing over here if you're not passionate about it, because you've said multiple times how important it is to keep up the tempo, right? And actually, if you're going to create something, if you're going to create an audience on social, if you're going to create a newsletter, whatever it is, your cadence is important. It's important to be consistent and to build that rapport with your audience. And the way to do that is to focus on what you're passionate about. So I love that.
100%. And like you mentioned, we're all multidimensional people, right? If somebody goes to LinkedIn and they see marketing, and then they go to Instagram and they see marketing, and then they go to Facebook and they see marketing, and then they read your newsletter and they read marketing, and then they go here and they see marketing, they're going to think that you are a unidimensional human.
You're a robot.
Yes, exactly. And they're like, wow, this AI is doing great on social media right now.
Totally.
But if they go to LinkedIn and they see, marketing, and then they go to your newsletter and they see mental health and neuroscience, and then they go to your podcast and they hear stories about you going to Slovakia, hint, hint, I'm like talking about my personal brand right now. Right. But like, and then you go to these other aspects, you become multidimensional, way more relatable, way easier for you to keep up with, way less prone to burnout. So lean into those different areas of yourself, because everybody has them, and they're not going to judge you if they go to different platforms and they find different versions of you, because we all have them.
I totally agree. I love that. And speaking of all the different platforms, can you tell people where to get in touch with you if they want to? If they want to ask you questions about the newsletter, Indie Collective, Apex, tell people how to find you.
Talk about setting you up for like a homer for the and I love that.
Beautiful wrap up.
So if you are if you are a coach, a consultant, a freelancer, somebody that is 2-3 years into building their business, you've hit 6 figures, you're trying to figure out like, oh crap, like this is real now. How do I go from step 2 to step 50? Indie Collective is a 10-week curriculum. I'm the head of community there. Goes all the way from like, how do I design my life, through how do I productize a service? How do I price to value, not to hours, so that you can have freedom of time? Just follow Indie Collective, INDE Collective, on LinkedIn, or you can find our newsletter, The Modern Independent, on LinkedIn as well. The podcast, The Modern Independent, if you just Google that, we have stories of dozens of graduates and experts. Sam, you were on that podcast. People that are in the industry that are really passionate about what they do. hours of content that you can listen to. If you're curious about psychology, running your own marketing firm / collective, business operations, neuroscience, there's a whole bunch of different random things that I constantly go down rabbit holes on. So if you just, like a mixed bag of randomness, but all really well thought out and a lot of research put into it, you can find me at Jan, looks like Jan, Jan, Almasy on Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads. I mean, it's all across the platforms. And then my newsletter, 3 Things I Learned Last Week, is also lives on LinkedIn. So those are probably the best spots.
Cool. And I actually follow you and Indie Collective across all of the platforms. And on my end, if you want to get in touch with me, whether it's about newsletters, freelancing, building a small business, whatever it is, if you want to talk to me about food and traveling, those are also 2 things I'm very passionate about. I'm Samantha Anderl across all of the platforms. And then you can also find Harlow is at Meet Harlow across all the platforms. Jan, this was amazing. Thank you so much actually for joining me from a different country today at 9 p.m. your time. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.